in a country where people come from all over the world, often driven here by the unfolding of historical events. The history of Cuba, of Haiti, of El Salvador, of Mexico, and so many other places is always already present here. History, as I said in the beginning, always looks different depending on where one stands. But it depends, too, on the lens and the frames that we use to look.
Good evening. My name is Ángeles Picone, and I'm an assistant professor of modern Latin American history here at Boston College. Welcome to the fourth Lowell Humanities Series event in the spring semester. The Lowell Humanities Series is a tradition that dates back to 1957. The event today is co-sponsored by the Boston College History Department, by the Romance Languages and Literatures Department, by the Hans Blom Memorial Lecture Series, and the McMullen Museum of Art. It is a joy for me to introduce tonight's speaker, Ada Ferrer. She is currently the Julius Silver Professor of History and Latin American and Caribbean Studies at New York University, where she has taught since 1995. I first encountered Ferrer's work as a graduate student. Back then, I did not know she was an award-winning Cuban American historian. And when I say award-winning historian, I actually mean it, because she has won an award for each book. Her first book, Insurgent Cuba, Race, Nation, and Revolution between 1868 and 1898, was perhaps one of the first books I read in one of my first seminars as a graduate student. It focused on how independence movements in Cuba shaped ideas of race and nationality. Back then, this book stood out to me as a way of thinking about history, the history of nation-making, as a dynamic blob of ideas, decisions, contingencies, and practices. This monograph constituted a major contribution to our field in understanding a cross-racial, multi-class movement that crafted an idea of nationality based on racial equality, but also the hurdles to put these ideas into practice within the insurgent army. This monograph received the 2000 Berkshire Book Prize for the best first book by a woman in any field in history. But I think I also connected with Ferrer's work, not only as a historian of Latin America, but also as a migrant. In the prologue to her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Cuba and American History, which she will discuss today, Ferrer offers a window into this. She was born in Cuba between the invasion of the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And for those of you who don't know, this is between 1961 and 1962. Her mother emigrated and settled in the US when Ferrer was just a baby. Her research was shaped by this crucial life event of which she had no control. She went back to Cuba in 1990, and since then, she has been listening to stories, visiting places, researching in archives. In her own words, she reconstructed the island's past and her own from a patchwork of documents, soon realizing that she was making sense of the role of the United States in Cuban history. And in doing so, I believe she has offered one of the many ways in which migrants and children of migrants in the United States see the world through their family histories, highlighting both the shared experience of in-betweenness, but also the unique trauma of migration. I especially saw this in her deeply moving essay, My Brother's Keeper, published in The New Yorker on February 22nd, 2021, which I encourage you all to read. In this essay, Ferrer recounts the ripple effects of the Cuban Revolution of 1959, forcing her mother to make the extremely difficult decision of leaving another child behind. Her mother went back for him in 1980 during the Mariel boat lift, when the Cuban government authorized the emigration of anyone who wanted to leave off the port of Mariel, provided they had someone to pick them up. I find this essay particularly powerful because it condenses the historian's craft in beautiful writing. In it, Ferrer threads together the impact of the Cuban Revolution on her personal life, showcasing that big events have tangible consequences on real people. The history of these people matters. In this context, both personal and professional, Ferrer found herself explaining Cuba to a US American audience and translating the US to Cubans. Their history were intrinsically connected, just as they were in her own personal history. This interconnectedness perhaps animated her second book, Freedom's Mirror, Cuba and Haiti in the Age of Revolution, which examines the consequences of the Haitian Revolution in Cuba. Fearing a slave rebellion on their own territory, Cuba planters and authorities sought to consolidate slavery and colonial rule. As you can anticipate, Ferrer received numerous awards for these monographs, including 3 prizes from the American Historical Association. She was supported by several fellowships, including the Guggenheim Foundation, the Dorothy and Lewis Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Fulbright Commission, and the Social Science Research Council. The book that Ada Ferrer will discuss today, Cuba and American History, offers a sweeping, intimate history between the United States and Cuba before they were the United States and Cuba through the 21st century. In it, we witness Ferrer's powerful prose with a final reminder that history is not only propelled by heroes, but also by the anonymous people that are nested in its way. In her own words, as history makes people, so do people make history. Please welcome Professor Ada Ferrer.
Well, before I begin, I want to thank Angeles Picone for the lovely introduction, and to thank Sylvia Sellers Garcia and Abby Goldstein and the Lowell Humanities series for inviting me to speak with you tonight, and all of you for turning out on what feels like maybe a soon-to-be spring March day. So welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm here tonight to talk to you about this book that you just heard a little bit about, called Cuba and American History. Now, the book, as many of you know, or some of you may know, is a kind of synthetic, is a synthetic history of 500 plus years of Cuban history, from the eve of the arrival of Christopher Columbus to the present, through the death of Fidel Castro, the election of Donald Trump, the election of Joe Biden. The scope of the book makes it challenging to summarize it in a 40-minute lecture. And just selecting one part of it as emblematic of the whole also feels very difficult to do. So rather than do either of those things today, I'm going to use this opportunity to reflect on the book as a way to think with you about the categories and the boundaries of historical writing more generally. So what are some of the categories of historical writing that the book engages? The first is obvious: national history. It's been the dominant mode of interpretation and historical writing since the 19th century through the 20th century. It enthroned the nation state as history's primary unit of analysis. And as a history of Cuba, the book in some ways fits in that mold. The second category of writing that I want to refer to is what we often call transnational history, which has emerged in the last 20 years or so to challenge the primacy of national history by focusing instead on connections and movements of people, of ideas, of things, of events that cross national and other boundaries. Those connections were always there, but the primacy of the nation as the principal unit of historical analysis tended to leave them out of most frames of analysis. Transnational history, on the other hand, can reveal them in all their dynamism. Now, my history of Cuba draws on both national and transnational modes of history writing and history telling. Even the title, Cuba and American History, is a play between the two kinds of history. Does the title mean that the book is a history of Cuba in a greater American context, meaning a hemispheric context that includes Latin America? No, not really. Might the title then refer to a history diplomatic in nature, a history of the relationship, social, political, cultural, economic, diplomatic, between the two countries? Not exactly. So the book, as I see it, and as I tried to write it, is at its most simple, fundamental level, a history of Cuba. But it is a history of Cuba that pays particular attention to the thorny entanglements of Cuban history with U.S. history. Throughout, I highlight the depth, the breadth, and the complexity of the intimate, usually unequal relationship between the two places over a very long period of time. The connections between the two countries stretch back over centuries, and they reach well beyond either government. It's not a question of a relationship between two governments, it's a question of a relationship between two people. And importantly, that relationship between Cuba and the US runs in both directions. It's not only a question of the US influencing Cuba, the influences and the back and forth are multi-directional. The book, then, is not a straightforward national history, nor is it strictly a transnational history or a comparative one. Rather, it is a history that purposely plays with perspective. It begins from a simple and obvious premise, namely that history always looks different depending on where one stands. Seen from Cuba, America looks different. Indeed, it is not even America, a name that Cubans, like most others around the world, used to name not the United States, but the two continents and the islands of the Western Hemisphere. Cuban history, meanwhile, is many things. And one of the things that I argue that Cuban history is a mirror to the history of the United States. So that this history of Cuba, my history of Cuba, besides being a history of the island, can also serve as what I call a shadow history, a necessarily selective, incomplete history of the United States, reimagined from Cuban ground and Cuban waters. In what follows, I'm going to focus on two very broad sections of the book. The first on slavery, the institution of slavery, and the second on the history of the Cuban Revolution, to reflect not only on how the history of these two countries, the US and Cuba, are intimately entangled, but also to reflect on how the modes of national and transnational history are themselves often already interconnected and indeed inseparable. Okay, so I'm going to start with slavery. As you might well imagine, in any history of Cuba, which was the world's largest producer of sugar, and together with Brazil and the US South, one of the major slave societies of the 19th century, the institution of slavery necessarily looms large. Histories of slavery can be written from within multiple frameworks. Histories of the slave trade, for example, are by their nature inherently international. African diasporic perspectives often explicitly challenge national histories. Histories of the relationship between slavery and capitalism necessarily cross national and imperial boundaries. At the same time, a rich social history of slavery sometimes bypasses national frames by focusing on units smaller than the nation, on regions within colonies and countries, on territories determined not by political boundaries, but say by the prevalence of a particular crop. Sometimes they even focus on specific plantations. In my book, slavery looms large in the discussion of the 18th and 19th century. And throughout, I draw on all these approaches. So one of the main chapters, or several chapters on the institution of slavery, and one of them, chapter 9, begins in perhaps a surprising place. It begins with scenes from a U.S. presidential inauguration in 1853, and it was the inauguration of Franklin Pierce. I don't know if you can see him. He's in the top row in the middle, kind of standing by himself. I begin the chapter with the inauguration, and at that inauguration, someone was missing, and that was the newly elected Vice President of the United States, a man named William Rufus King. Now, why begin a chapter on Cuban slavery in Washington, D.C. with this inauguration? Why not begin it on a Cuban sugar plantation or even on the west coast of Africa? I do that not because I prefer writing about U.S. presidents to writing about enslaved men and women in Cuba, not at all. Rather, by starting in Washington, D.C., I call attention to another kind of history of Cuban slavery, one in which the U.S. itself, its governments, its citizens, its economy are deeply and utterly implicated. So William Rufus King, the vice president who's missing from this image here, was a Southerner and a slaveholder. And he was too ill to attend the inauguration in 1853. So he received permission from Congress to take his oath of office on foreign soil. You can guess what foreign soil that was. William Rufus King took his oath of office on a Cuban sugar plantation. Yes, the first time I read it, you had to do a double take, so I'll say it again. A newly elected vice president of the United States was sworn in on a sugar plantation in Matanzas, Cuba, in the height of the sugar harvest season. Now, the story of, I should just say, it happened because he had grown ill during the campaign. He contracted tuberculosis, and in the 19th century, American doctors thought that to cure tuberculosis, it was good for people to go to Cuba, take in the airs, stay in the countryside, and go to a sugar plantation and spend hours in the mill, in the factory house where the sugar was being processed, under the assumption that the vapors and the fumes and the heat would cure them of tuberculosis. It was called the sugar cure. So it didn't work. He died. When he realized he was going to die, he went back to Alabama and died like a day after arriving. So it didn't work. Now, the story of the inauguration of an American vice president in Cuba is unexpected, right? But yet I find it totally fitting, and it is fitting in more ways than one. First, King had won on a ticket committed to making Cuba American. In the victory march the day after the election, supporters had carried banners that read, "Pierce and Cuba." At his inauguration speech, Pierce had promised an aggressive stance on foreign acquisitions and territorial expansion, and everyone knew that he was talking about Cuba. So having Vice President King take his oath of office on a sugar plantation in Matanzas, I argue, marked Cuba as imminent American territory. Pierce and King also took office in the aftermath of 3 failed filibustering expeditions to Cuba. Now, filibusterism, I don't know how many of you have encountered before. It's not, it is what happens in Congress, but it's not only that. In the 19th century, it referred to a phenomenon of ostensibly private expeditions launched from U.S. soil to liberate Cuba from Spain, proclaim a transitory independence, and then seek immediate annexation to the United States. The purpose of filibustering was twofold. First, to protect Cuban slavery, both from an internal revolution from below and from British abolitionism from without. And second, it was meant to expand the power of U.S. slavery, because Cuba would be annexed to the U.S. as multiple slave states. As the classic work of scholars such as Eric Williams and José Luciano Franco reminds us, the institution of slavery always has a political history. And filibusterism and annexationism are a critical part of that political history, both for Cuba and U.S. slavery. King's inauguration in Cuba, then, serves as a reminder that the history of slavery in both places overlaps with the history of U.S. expansionism and U.S. empire. The spectacle of an Alabama slaveholder taking office as vice president of the U.S. in the heart of Cuban sugar country was fitting in another way as well. It laid bare a fundamental truth, that King's home in Washington, D.C. and Alabama, and King's improvised sanitarium in Matanzas were part of a system that linked the U.S. economy to Cuban sugar and Cuban slavery. That had been true since at least the 1820s. By the time of King's inauguration in 1853, that system had fully matured. Gradually, since independence, and then more decisively after Spain's 1817 concession of free trade to Cuba, the economies of the U.S. and Cuba were becoming intricately enmeshed. By the eve of the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, the U.S. was Cuba's principal trading partner, far outpacing even Spain itself. For the U.S., meanwhile, Cuba consistently ranked as one of the country's top 3 trading partners. The deepening of these trade ties was premised above all on the expansion of sugar and slavery in Cuba. As the Cuban economy increasingly turned to sugar, the island looked to the U.S. to import everything from luxury goods to basic foodstuffs to industrial machinery. Meanwhile, sugar refiners in New York purchased raw brown sugar from Cuba, processed it in the U.S. into refined white sugar, and then sold it at a significant profit in both the domestic and international market. That all Cuban sugar was grown by enslaved workers meant that fluctuations in the wholesale price of U.S. refined sugar correlated almost perfectly with fluctuations in the price of African captives in Cuba. New York sugar agents had agents on the island. New York sugar merchants had their agents on the island. They dealt with Cuban sugar planters the same way they did with cotton planters in places like Alabama, advancing credit on the next year's crop. Cuban planters used the credit to purchase more African captives or to purchase machinery for their mills. When the crop disappointed, American merchants ended up as owners or partial or full owners of Cuban sugar plantations. Then, Cuban sugar profits were invested in U.S. industries, such as coal, iron, manufacturing, railroads, banking, and so on. The most famous example here is a man named Moses Taylor, a New York sugar broker who made his early fortune in what everyone called the Cuba trade, and then invested it in banking and industry. Within a few decades, he was president of the National City Bank of New York, precursor to today's Citibank. In recent years, it has become something of a commonplace to point out that slavery built capitalism, that slavery was the beating heart of an economic system that linked the North and South. But neither slavery nor capitalism were ever circumscribed by national boundaries. Slave-grown cotton from the U.S. South fed the textile mills and factories of the Industrial Revolution in England and the U.S. North. But slave-grown sugar from Cuba helped kill the hunger of their workers. And the profits from slave-grown sugar from Cuba fueled the growth of American industries. Cuba, its sugar, its slavery, its slave trade is part of the history of American capitalism. That the U.S. was deeply implicated in Cuban slavery is evident in the prices of sugar and slaves, or in the activities of U.S. merchant houses. But it was also evident on very local ground in Cuba, on very specific spaces of slavery and enslavement, in plantations, manor houses, slave quarters, fields, mills, in the relations between masters and the men and women they held in bondage. For even the most local, quotidian, on-the-ground histories of slavery are often also transnational histories. Since we began with a U.S. vice president on a Cuban sugar plantation in 1853, let us return there. Situated in the province of Matanzas It was part of a network of plantations owned by U.S. citizens. American visitors did circuits through these U.S.-owned plantations because they said visiting Cuba and not seeing a sugar plantation was like reading Hamlet and skipping the Prince of Denmark's speeches. Every autumn, American engineers descended on the area to prepare the mills and tend to the U.S.-made machines during the 5-month harvest. Americans were also deeply implicated in the illegal slave trade that supplied captive Africans to the plantations, to plantations such as the Ariadne. By one estimate, U.S.-built ships accounted for about 63% of captives introduced in Cuba. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, in the 1850s and 1860s, almost 164,000 captives were landed in Cuba, often on ships that had begun their slaving voyages in the U.S. from places like Baltimore, New Orleans, New Bedford, Mass., and even New York City. Of the captives for whom we know the specific port of arrival in Cuba, almost half went to Matanzas province, which is where the vice president ended up. Among the laborers harvesting and making sugar all around him then, as he took the sugar cure, were men and women enslaved, procured, transported, and sold by King's fellow Americans. The region of Matanzas had been home to U.S.-owned plantations for decades. One prominent Rhode Island family owned multiple plantations in the region for decades. That was the DeWolf family, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with them. James DeWolf was not only a plantation owner, but also a slave trader and a U.S. senator. Even after the slave trade became illegal in the U.S. and by Americans, DeWolf continued to carry human cargo aboard his ships and to sell them in Cuba. He owned 3 plantations on the island, and family members by blood and marriage owned another 3. That meant that New England men supervised the clearing of forests for the construction of mills. They managed the production and sale of sugar. They bought and sold people. They separated families. They meted out punishments. And diaries such as this one document the administration of punishment even by some of the DeWolf administrators. And one of DeWolf's nephews, who managed another family plantation, even allowed neighboring Cuban slaveholders to use the DeWolf stocks. The stocks were wooden instruments of torture to punish their own enslaved. So neighboring plantation owners could bring people to be punished on the DeWolf plantation. From the slave ships unloading human beings under the cover of night, to the workers stooped over the cane, to the machines in the mills, to the railroads heading to port with the sugar, to the agents trading the product, American citizens were implicated in every part of Cuba's slave system. If we can trace the profits of Cuban sugar in American industry and finance, in the account books of the plantations, etc., we can also see that sometimes those profits could appear in the most unexpected places. For example, as a modest monthly stipend sent back home to, say, St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Bristol, Rhode Island, home of the DeWolf family, where if you look at the plantation records, you see the monthly annotation of money being sent to this church, which still exists, which obviously still exists today. So in the way I write about slavery then in the book is one that moves back and forth between multiple frames and scales, local, national, transnational. It is possible to, in that way, to tell entangled histories in which boundaries blur, and the U.S. is present in Cuba, and Cuba is present in the United States. Okay, So that it gives you a sense of how I treated slavery. Again, because the book is so big and covers so much, it's not so big. I mean, a lot of it, if you don't be scared. If you look at it and see how thick it is, a lot of it is notes at the end. But anyway, it covers the, 500 years. So I just gave you kind of a window into some of the way I treat the 19th century and the institution of slavery. And I should say that in other work that I've done, I've dealt much more with the history of slavery on the ground in Cuba, but again, treating it in relation to other things like the Haitian Revolution or independence from Spain, et cetera. But throughout, what I try to do is just to keep all these levels and scales at play so that you have, U.S. slave traders, involved in this trade. William Rufus King is in the sugar mill, and around him are people who are captive, who've been enslaved by many of his peers. And you read the diaries of people like the DeWolf administrators, and they tell, or letters that they sent to family, and you get little snippets of life in these places. So I learned, for example, that people in the slave quarters use the light of glowworms, right? Glowworms, to serve as candles, right? So you keep all these levels, the most intimate, the most detailed. You keep it in focus as you tell these bigger stories about a transnational history of capitalism and so on. So I hope that gives you an idea of the 19th century. I'm going to fast forward and go to the 20th century and talk a little bit about the Cuban Revolution. When I was writing the book, a lot of people used to say, well, people are just going to get the book and skip to January 1959. I hope that's not the case, but I feel like I can't give a talk without talking about the Cuban Revolution. So that's where I'm going to head next, to a very different part of the book. And here, in talking about the Cuban Revolution, as in talking about slavery, there are multiple frames from which to approach the history of this event. There is an extensive historiography dating back almost to the revolution itself that puts 1959 and the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro in a global Cold War framework. There's also a scholarship that puts it in a more bilateral framework of U.S.-Cuban relations, okay? But in the last 10 years or so, there has developed a vibrant new scholarship on the Cuban Revolution that has focused our attention on what scholars call the Cuban Revolution from within. And they focus on everyday histories of revolution, of everyday life, of ordinary people after 1959. So we've gotten new cultural and social histories of things like childhood, of the family, of dance, of sport, of race and gender, of agrarian reform and migration. I think that this is some of the most exciting work currently being done on the Cuban Revolution. But I also believe strongly that doing that kind of work on the everyday experience of revolution does not necessarily require us to distinguish between the revolution from within and the broader transnational context in which it unfolded. Whether Cubans at the time liked it or not, they had to make and live the revolution in a volatile Cold War context in which the actions of the U.S. often forced themselves into Cubans' field of vision. Similarly, to understand the international aspects of the revolution does not require that we turn our attention away from Cubans on the ground, living the revolution day to day. American policy had to contend with the question of Cuban people, of their relationship to the revolutionary state, their relationship to the US, their relationship to the possibility of migration, just to name a few. To illustrate the necessity of engaging in what we might call this multi-scalar approach, I want to talk about two moments or themes that figure in any transnational history of the Cuban Revolution. One is the confrontation with the United States, and the other is the history of immigration and exile after 1959. One of the most dramatic and important moments in the confrontation between Cuba and the U.S. after 1959 was the U.S. invasion at the Bay of Pigs. Now, studies and analyses of the Bay of Pigs began immediately after the event happened. The CIA's Inspector General reviewed hundreds and hundreds of documents, interviewed over 100 participants to understand and to affix blame for the U.S.'s failure. Meanwhile, a Yale political psychologist invented the term groupthink specifically to explain the particular kind of failure represented by the Bay of Pigs. In these early analyses, as in much work that has come after, the emphasis has been on U.S. planning and on U.S. actions. That is not surprising. Most of the documents available are U.S. documents. Moreover, American power exerted on a world stage often commands center stage later on in analyses. But as a historian of a place where the U.S. exercised outside influence and power, I am interested in the ways in which the history and actions of the people in those places where the U.S. intervenes can shape the course and the outcome of U.S.-directed events. So when I wrote about the Bay of Pigs, I wanted to highlight an important truth: that when U.S. power, U.S. policy, U.S. governments operate abroad, they don't simply function on a blank slate. The deep histories, the complex social fields of those places shapes the exercise of U.S. power. So I begin my chapter on the Bay of Pigs in the swamp, before the landing. Actually, I begin eons before the landing, and then a year or two before the landing. So I'm going to just, this is what I'm going to read next is basically adapted from the book, but I'm just going to do that. I tried to made it a little shorter, but it'll also give you a sense of the writing in the book and so on, okay? This is how that chapter on the Bay of Pigs begins. Located about 85 miles and worlds away from Havana, the vast Zapata Peninsula, that's where the invasion unfolded, houses living species as old as the Brontosaurus and pterodactyls. Reeds rise up from a vast expanse of thick water, underneath which lies a dense, tangled forest of hardwood timber, many thousands of years old. In the rivers and lakes of the peninsula still swims the Cuban gar, a species so old and unchanged that scientists categorize it as a living fossil. Much of the swamp extends to the Caribbean Sea. Along parts of the coast is a large shelf of dog's teeth rock, so named for the hard, jagged limestone that made the area inhospitable, even after humans had begun to put shoes on draft animals. Near the eastern end of the vast wetlands is an inlet. Like the swamp, this bay boasts ancient species, among them the reef dweller that probably gave the bay its name, the queen triggerfish, known in Cuba as cochinos, or pigs, Bay of Pigs. Humans arrived later, much later, and gave names to those places and those species. Generations of Taino Indians made their home in this unusual terrain, burying their dead feet always to the west under mounds that alternated black earth and snail shells. In 1493, Columbus hugged the coast of the swamp on his second voyage. A century later, pirates were said to hide their treasure there. And 2 centuries after that, slave traders would use the unwelcoming coast to land illegal cargoes of Africans, forced after their long, grueling voyage across the Atlantic to trek over the dog-teeth limestone in bare feet. But these illicit uses aside, the place was so inhospitable that it was settled but sparsely, whether by native Tainos or Spaniards or Africans or the descendants of any or all of these. The swamp was hardly arable, and there were no towns to speak of, so the people who did settle there worked hard to make a living. They harvested the swamp, using rudimentary tools and the weight of their own body, bodies to loosen the thick, gnarled roots from under a foot or more of thick water. They excavated small patches of earth, built fires in them, and burned the wood to make charcoal. That was their occupation, and charcoal was the region's main industry. There was one route in and out of the swamp, a narrow-gauge railroad track. Often covered with water and unusable, it left people who lived there cut off from the rest of the island for weeks at a time. It was there, in that swamp. You think I'm going to talk about the Bay of Pigs now, right? It was there, in that swamp, that Fidel Castro arrived by helicopter on December 24th, 1959, to celebrate his first Christmas in power. He arrived with soda, beer, and a pig and a half, and invited himself and his 13 companions to Christmas Eve dinner at the house of a resident charcoal worker. I remember, recalled the man later, Fidel said to me, "You are all going to see how buses from Havana are going to come here." I thought he was nuts, said the man. Yet by the following Christmas, a newly built highway into the swamp was facilitating the transformation of the whole area. There was a new and fully staffed general hospital, an aqueduct, an electric plant, and a telegraph. A new shopping center had a clothing store, a pharmacy, a barber shop, and a post office. And on the beautiful beach called Giron, surrounded by some of the poorest, most unusual countryside on the island, the new government was building a seaside resort, 153 fully furnished 1- and 2-bedroom cabins in a complex that boasted a swimming pool, cabaret, game room, and more. Construction on the resort started just a few weeks after Fidel Castro showed up for Christmas Eve dinner, and the opening date was set for May 20th, 1961, the 59th anniversary of Cuban independence and the end of the first U.S. military occupation. Almost exactly 1 month before the scheduled opening of the beach resort, some 1,400 men, all but 2 of them Cuban, waited offshore from that coast, completely unaware of all that activity. They were there on orders of the U.S. to invade Cuba. They planned to link up with internal resistance movements and spark an anti-Castro rebellion. 3 days in, a new provisional government for Cuba would arrive from Miami. Once that happened, the 1,400 men would proceed north from the beachhead, turn left, and march on Havana. Some expected that Castro's government might fall even before their arrival in the capital. If things went more slowly, or if the men ran into trouble, they would fade into the mountains, link up with insurgents there, and wage the kind of guerrilla warfare against the Cuban government that Fidel Castro himself had waged a few years earlier. The first to realize that things would not go as planned might have been the men of the underwater demolition team motoring a small launch toward the beach that first night. Their job was to set up marker lights that would guide the large vessels and their landing gear onto the shore to disembark the brigade members. But as the frogmen approached the shore, they understood their job would not be so simple. The place, one of them remembered later, was lit up like Coney Island, and 50 yards from where they intended to land, people were having a party. Floodlights were lighting up our landing point like daylight, he said. Basically, the invaders had inadvertently happened upon a seaside resort under construction and a party of the workers at one night as construction neared its end. They also landed in a place that in the 2 years of revolution had probably changed more than in the 2 centuries before. To begin this narrative of the Bay of Pigs invasion in the swamp, with Cuban geography and Cuban history, with actual residents of the area, is to remind the reader that any discussion of the U.S. failure there has to encompass all of that. No landing or invasion ever occurs on a blank slate, or more literally, an empty beach. History and place cannot be willed away. The Bay of Pigs, like so much else then, is at once a very local story and part of a broader global history of US-Cuba relations and the global Cold War. Historians are used to thinking of historical actors living in multiple temporalities, in multiple time, in deep geological time, in a longue durée where the large social and economic structures reside, and in the more immediate temporality of the event. If that is true for time, it is also true for space. The construction workers, as well as local residents, civilian militia members, literacy workers, all the people who were there in the area when the invasion happened, were actors in a very local history, in a national history, in a history of bilateral relations, and in a global history at the same time. And actually the failure of that invasion, I don't have time to talk about it today, the failure of the US failure at the Bay of Pigs is deeply connected to what would happen the following year, which is the missile crisis of October 1962. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but I won't have time. So now in this final section of the very short final section of the talk, I want to bring up another important area in the history of the Cuban Revolution that forces us to consider the relationship between national and transnational scales. And that is the history of migration after 1959. By definition, migration is an international, transnational topic. People move across national boundaries. But quite often, it is also treated as national history. That is, once a group of people migrates, they often get folded into the history of that new country. So we get studies of immigrants and immigrant enclaves. Wonderful books, for example, on Mexican Chicago, for instance, or Filipino Louisiana, or Cuban Miami. But I want to think about the question of migration as both transnational and national history in a different way. The famed historian of Atlantic revolutions, R.R. Palmer, once ventured that the intensity of a revolution could be calculated objectively by counting the number of people who fled it. In Cuba, a lot of people left, more than 25,000 in 1959. By late 1960, 1,500 Cubans were arriving in the US every week. By late 1961, the US Immigration and Naturalization Service was receiving an astounding 1,200 applications per working day from Cubans wanting to move to the US. All told, between the start of the Cuban Revolution in January 1959 and the suspension of direct US Cuba flights in October 1962, over 250,000 people left. Numbers, in the end, give quantitative credence to a qualitative impression. The Cuban Revolution was nothing if not intense. We know, of course, that migration did not end with the consolidation of the revolution. Other waves followed, some of them even more concentrated. Dramatic ones, like the Mariel boat lift of 1980, which brought 125,000 Cubans to Florida in the space of about 5 months, or the rafter crisis of 1994. There were also quieter and slower waves of migration, like the Freedom Flights that brought around 300,000 Cubans to the US between 1965 and 1973. And today, we have the largest Cuban migratory wave of all, one that has brought about 500,000 people to the US-Mexico border from Cuba in the last 28 months. So basically, migration doesn't end with the exiles that became so famous or with the crises of Mariel or 1994. It is ongoing in a really dramatic way right now. It's like 4% of the Cuban population has left in the last 2 years, so astounding. Cuban outmigration, in particular to the US, has served as a central force in the history of Cuba since 1959. It has shaped people's experience of living in revolutionary and post-revolutionary Cuba. The possibility of leaving or of being left became part of everyday life, and weighty decisions about whether to stay or to go shaped individual and collective experiences of revolution. Loved ones applied for passports. Neighbors left valuables with neighbors to safeguard. People tired of all the goodbyes. In March 1962, one Havana resident complained that he could do things only in snatches of time, as he was continually interrupted by visits of people leaving. Here, even the cat is leaving, he wrote to a friend. Letters back and forth over decades, sometimes with chewing gum and razors tucked between their pages. Sometimes they had pieces of paper tracing the outline of a foot so that someone could ask for shoes in the right size. Much later, more recently, they would exchange memes on WhatsApp. Or, for people crossing the border, they would share their location on the voyage from Nicaragua to the US-Mexico border. Today, there are whole blocks in some cities in Cuba where the only people under the age of 40 are children. Like so much else, the history of migration cannot be understood solely within a national or transnational framework. Migration is not just the history of movement. It is not just the history of settlement in a new place. It is also the history of the people left behind. It is a history of those goodbyes, of all those decisions, basically the vacuums that people leave remain part of the history of those places as well. So migration is also a history that unfolds in Cuba. And this brings me to my final point about a scale or a frame of history that I have not yet mentioned, but which is implicit in a lot of what I said. And that scale or frame is a personal or a family one, which Angeles referred to before. Personal or family history has emerged in the last few years as a powerful and innovative model of historical writing. From conferences with titles such as Scholars and Their Kin, to panels at the AHA, to recent and forthcoming books by historians across multiple fields, people like Kendra Fields, who works here at Tufts, Martha Hodes, Martha Jones, Nathan Connolly, Claudia Lomnitz, Mark Mazauer, Hazel Carby, and many, many more. My book, which is a 500-plus year history of Cuba, is not a family history. But the history that I was driven to tell in this book is inseparable from my history and my family's history. I am in this country, in large part because of the history that this book tells. I am here, and I am American. And that leads me to wonder about the stories and the histories that we all carry. In a country where people come from all over the world, often driven here by the unfolding of historical events, the history of Cuba, of Haiti, of El Salvador, of Mexico, and so many other places is always already present here. History, as I said in the beginning, always looks different depending on where one stands. But it depends, too, on the lens and the frames that we use to look. I believe that it behooves us as historians and as scholars to keep multiple frames in play at the same time. Traces of the history of enslaved people in Cuba are present in a local church in Bristol, Rhode Island. Construction workers on a Cuban beach foil the plans of US presidents and generals. International migration invades the most intimate of spaces, the subject of pained pillow talk and dinner table conversation. There is no clear place where one kind of history ends and another begins. Taking that as a point of departure, my book invites readers to see history through different lenses. It invites Cuban readers to see Cuban history through the eyes of each other. It invites US readers to see their own country refracted through the eyes of another, from the outside in, much as I have lived and understood both Cuba and the United States most of my life. So, thank you.
Regarding cane sugar farming, can you compare it to the days of slavery to what it is today? What's the fraction? Full? How much is there?
Oh, well, I mean, I don't have a specific figure for right now, but there's a lot less sugar now. Sugar's been a constant in Cuban history. It expanded a lot in the 20th century, after the wars of independence, the U.S. intervened in Cuba, Spanish-American War. They staged a military occupation. They changed laws around land ownership. And you saw, even in the 1840s and 50s, there were all these U.S.-owned plantations and matanzas, but the number of U.S.-owned plantations and sugar mills, because by then it had become more mechanized, so it wasn't just the plantation, it was a mill that processed it and produced it. The U.S. had an enormous role and presence. So by about 1930, something like 2/3 of the Cuban sugar industry was controlled by the U.S. Okay? When the revolution happens, the government initially wants to diversify the economy, and it wasn't just that, but even before that, Cuban governments had tried diversifying the economy so that it wasn't so dependent on sugar. In 1970, Fidel Castro organized, or it culminated in 1970, preparation began a little bit before, something called the 10 million ton sugar harvest. He wanted to produce the biggest sugarcane harvest in Cuban history. And he told people that if they achieved this 10 million ton harvest, that they would use the funds from that to industrialize, and that succeeding would signal the end of underdevelopment in Cuba. It didn't work for many reasons. I mean, they came pretty close, but it didn't work. And then in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, because actually in the 1970s, Cuba and the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc get much closer, and Cuba will sell sugar to the Soviet Union at inflated prices and get oil at deflated prices, right? So in some sense, the Soviet subsidies were tied to Cuban sugar. After the Soviet Union, because I'm giving you a rapid fire answer, but after the Soviet Union collapses and Cuba turns to tourism, there is a more definitive move away from sugar, and I think it was in like 2002, something like 75 large sugar mills were closed. I don't remember exactly the number, but many, many sugar mills were closed. So it's not, they still grow sugar, but it doesn't have nearly the role in the economy that it had, earlier in the 20th century or the 19th.
So your book is very anthropological, certainly, and I wonder if you could talk about whether you have family still in Cuba, how much time you spent there doing research for this book, and some of the sources that you might have pulled from, whether they be in Cuba or the United States in terms of these journals and things.
Yeah, so I first went back to Cuba I was born there, as I mentioned, or you mentioned. I left as an infant. That was in 1963 that I left. And then I went back for the first time in 1990 when I was doing dissertation research. And then from 1990 to the present, I've gone back very regularly. And my purpose in going has always been, I always have to do severe multitasking when I'm in Cuba, because I'm there to do historical research, so I spend most of my time, especially like during the day, in archives. And then on weekends and evenings, I would see family. And going so many years, I also have many friends, though many of my friends have left. So interacting with Cuba also means you make a set of friends, then they leave, then you make other friends, and they leave. It's kind of, Anyway, so I've probably gone, I don't know, like 36 times since 1990, on average, probably once a year, some years more, a few years, like during the pandemic, I didn't go. And mostly I've worked in the Cuban National Archives, which is an amazing institution. They just have incredible material, especially for the colonial period and the 18th and 19th century. So a lot of the archival research that I've done in Cuba has been on the colonial period. And then for this book goes to the present. So, what I did, this is a very different kind of book. My first two books were very archivally dense, right? They're monographs. They're based on, you read like 5 bundles and, you can conclude one sentence, right? Like this book doesn't have that kind of archival density because it's 500 years. You can't do deep archival research on 500 years unless you want to spend like close to 500 years working on the book. So what I did was, I relied on a lot of the archival research that I'd already done over those 30 plus years. And then I relied, there's so many, what historians call printed primary sources. So they're primary sources that are not archival, that are available in wonderful libraries like the New York Public Library or the Library of Congress. And then I did do kind of targeted archival research, like when I was working on that Bristol family, I went to the Bristol Historical Society, and that's where I found that journal and some of those letters. So basically, it was much more targeted research. And then the other thing that was incredibly helpful is that because this book has so much more to do with the U.S. than my other books, I discovered something. Are there any U.S. historians here? Okay, you may not like what I have to say, but I think that it is easier. I mean, the historical analysis and interpretation is the same everywhere. But in terms of finding sources, there's so much available online for U.S. history that I was just blown away. So like, the Founders Archive, Founders Online, where you could, or like the place in Virginia that has every presidential speech online. You can't do that for a place like Cuba. You can for Fidel Castro because there is that database, but other presidents. But mostly for the Bay of Pigs and Missile Crisis, the stuff that's available through the State Department records, Foreign Relations of the U.S., the National Security Archive, declassified materials. There is a website called the Mary Farrell Foundation. I don't know, has anyone worked with that? It's someone who is interested, a woman who's interested in theories about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So anything that could possibly be related has been amassed in this database where you have to join. And they have incredible things on the Bay of Pigs. And also just like, she has lists of people in Miami who were getting paid by the CIA, like with their addresses and their names. I mean, it's just amazing what you can find. So I, sometimes people say to you, but can't you just do it all online? No, you can't. Like, you have to go to archives. But there is, for the recent history of U.S. Cuba, there's a lot that's available online.
So I have a Cuban grandfather, well, his family, and my family all lives in Puerto Rico. And when he talks about when he was living there in a younger age, he has this strong sense of identity of like strong working man and all that. Well, I wanted to hear your opinion if you think the identity of the people that migrated away from Cuba is different from the people who stayed in the mainland, because spending a lot of years away from Cuba can definitely change a person. And I wanted to know if you have any insights on that and your opinion on it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would use the word identity, but yeah, I mean, where you live, where you grow up, where you're educated has a deep influence on how you think and how you see the world. So if someone's migrated to the U.S. and does all their schooling in the U.S. and grows up watching, American television, they probably will see the world differently than someone who has grown up in Cuba and, my generation watching Soviet cartoons and, going to cut, harvest potatoes during the harvest because, it's just a different life experience, and life experience determines how you see the world. So I do think that there will always be that difference, but that's not to say, but there's still a lot of commonality and overlap. And there's a lot of communication back and forth. I'm amazed sometimes when I go to Cuba how much they know about popular culture and other things in the U.S. And especially now, like if you go to Miami now, so many people have been coming that it doesn't feel that different to me than being in Cuba. Even the way people speak, the inflection, so I do think that it's not, there's differences, but there's not like a hard and fast divide. And I always tell students, I mentioned this in a session before, that you can't understand Cuba unless you spend time in Miami, right? And that's another thing, I emphasize that a lot because so many people have left. So it's like, you take any event in the history of the revolution, and there's people in Miami who've lived through it. There's people in Miami who might have even been protagonists in it, right? So I like exploring the linkages more than the differences.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your book. And I went to Cuba last March, and it was the only time I've been there. And I really didn't know that much about it, read your book afterwards. But I was struck by a few things. I'm wondering from your visits there and your research, how you might answer this. It seemed to me that there were so many promising things that happened from the revolution, right? It seemed like there were all these healthcare clinics, and I could see the housing that I think had been built. All the houses kind of looked alike in the rural areas, and I understand that literacy programs expanded, and even the big ice cream pavilion, right? I guess because the idea was, well, before this, only the wealthiest people could have ice cream. So some of those things, they seem so great. What do you think it would have taken for those what seem like very promising initiatives that, you know, all of us might like to see happen, to have flourished and not turned out the way it did? I mean, would it just have been, okay, the U.S. and other countries just had to keep their noses out, let them do their own thing, trade just as their own independent country? Or what do you think it would have taken? Thank you.
You know, one can answer that question in the abstract, right? So one might say, well, if the U.S. hadn't intervened, or if the Soviet Union hadn't become so close, but the thing is, the world is what it is, and history was what it was. So in order to imagine something different, you have to imagine away the Cold War. But you can't imagine away the Cold War. So I think, abstractly, I would say that the Cold War moment made it really hard for something to succeed. Then there's other things. There's a history of the relationship between Cuba and the U.S. that precedes the Cold War, and that made it hard for American. But again, you can't even then the Cold War becomes really important because they're reading what Cuba is doing in this Cold War framework, but they're doing it in a way that's not very informed. So that is why, like Richard Nixon, when Fidel Castro meets with him during his first visit to the U.S., Richard Nixon says to Fidel Castro, "You should do what Puerto Rico is doing." And of course, Puerto Rico is U.S. territory. Anyone who knows an iota of Cuban history knows that that was not what to tell Fidel Castro. But Richard Nixon seemed not to know that he shouldn't say that. So anyway, so I think answering it, it's just I'd have to will away too many things that can't be willed away. And then there were also like many decisions made over time. And one thing that I also emphasize with students is that people often talk about the Cuban Revolution as like the Cuban Revolution, right? But the Cuban Revolution, as it was struggling for power up to 1959, was very different than what took power in 1959, was very different than what emerged in 1961. So there isn't this one constant that remains unchanging. And the goals change over time. Like if you look at Fidel Castro's speeches before he came to power, they're very different than the speeches he would be giving by 1961 or 1963, right? There were things that happened. So I just think there's no easy answer. Thank you.